This week to the Greens to join the eco-left. What's your sense this Sunday of that dream of a united left government, even if it wouldn't have lasted very long?
Well, I think there's probably a sense of fear and disappointment among a lot of Green and eco-activists, because there is a worry still about the question of the LNGs. The only mention we've heard of is Shannon, the importation of fracked gas to Shannon, but there's already a very advanced deal being negotiated with an American company to import liquefied natural gas through the port of Cork. I think there'd be a lot of concern about that. There'd be huge concern about the fact that Simon Coveney, who led the Fine Gael negotiation team, was very emphatic to Gino Kenny during the week when he said there is no way that the Occupied Territories Bill will get passed, and Fine Gael have done everything to block that bill in the same manner that they did to block the climate emergency bill that we put in the last Dáil. So I really don't see much difference coming through. I have to agree with the last speaker, because what we've effectively had in the last 4 years is a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael-led government. And I think we're going to get this again. And I think that the environmental movement, the Green Party, has its difficulties, but I do think we have a long way to go in terms of trying to secure the idea that we need an absolute radical change to both deal with the climate and to get our public services back on track. If anything has showed us, it's been COVID, how poor our public services are. And we've heard no mention of health, education and all of the gaps that exist.
Malcolm Noonan, do you think that there will be, what do you say to Brid Smith and what do you say to members in your own party? Perhaps the Greens have made Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael come up with a programme for government that you might approve of in part. For instance, the Occupied Territories Bill, or for instance, the ban on imported fracked gas.
Well, I'm afraid it'll take a lot more than the Green Party to change Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. By their very existence, they're wedded to defending the corporate agenda, whether it's agribusiness, the fossil fuel industry, the construction industry. That is their very base and the very pulse of their political existence. And really to make any gains on climate, or indeed to make fundamental gains on delivering decent public services, you're going to need strong, radical parties who will challenge those at the top of these pyramids who dominate Irish society and who make the decisions about how food is produced, about how industry moves, about how the roads are built, our public transport is properly invested in. And those two parties represent very clearly the vested interests of the great and good in those industries. And I think it's going to take a lot more to break them away from that. And the Greens are in a minority here. I'm sure the programme for government will be full of wonderful rhetoric about environment and social justice and all the rest of it. But we've seen programmes for government before that are full of rhetoric. What we really need to see is the detail, and the devil is in the detail. But I honestly believe we're going to have to fight for that detail, particularly coming out of a pandemic into a recession where workers will be thrown on the scrap heap and farmers and other communities around the country are going to be penalised by imposing carbon taxes on them that try to address their individual behaviour rather than looking at systemic change, which is what is needed here. And so I have no starry-eyed idea about the programme before I read it. Of course I'll read it. I'll read it in detail, but I am aware that there will be a huge amount of rhetoric that will be dressed up in flowery language without the actual detail. I put my house on that there's going to be a lot of flowery language and rhetoric in this that will not pan out. So what we do need is a radical left government, and we're not being given the opportunity to even discuss that possibility because of the way the negotiations have been handled.
Simon Harris is keen to get in there.
I'm very keen to get in on you because there's already an attempt to rewrite history. We had a general election 100.
Wider racism in our society.
Well, I think diversity in Leinster House would be brilliant to see it, but I think that we've a way to go. I was 5 years a chairperson of the Traveller Committee in Dublin City Council, and to say that racism ran right throughout the system and through the bureaucracy is an understatement. I was quite shocked that at every level, anti-traveller racism was embedded into the way the system worked. And I believe that still is the case. It doesn't go away overnight. And you know, the fish rots from the head. And if there's systemic racism in our society, whether it's in schools, among the Gardaí, in local authorities, then the society itself and the way it conducts itself, the top of society, is to blame for it. And we can't start just dealing with individuals' behaviour. We have to make sure that the system is open and accountable to everybody. And I think that is where we need to start. Now, I missed the conversation because my phone died. But on the question of Eamon Ryan, I don't believe for 1 minute that anybody thinks that Eamon Ryan is a racist. But we do have to be careful about language, and that is something that there needs to be awareness about. But I think the most important thing is to end the systemic racism of things like direct provision, which is obvious. I don't believe the Gardaí keep records on racist crime, and I can tell you for certain, I could make the hair stand on your head, the amount of systemic racism I've seen against the travelling community in official Ireland.
Simon Harris, will the next government be the government that ends direct provision, which is a call we've heard from many quarters recently?
I absolutely think it should be mandatory on public transport, but the reason they're dragging their heels on making it mandatory is not that there is some differences of opinion in medical science, but I believe the real reason is that they should do what they did in Spain and Italy, and that is have masks provided to commuters at transport hubs. You can't just rely on making it mandatory and expect people to always turn up with them. So they need to be provided. Now, I just want to return to the question of the schools, because the one thing that's been left out of the entire conversation is the real problem we have in this country is that we have the highest level of pupil-teacher ratio in the whole of the Eurozone and one of the highest levels in the whole of the OECD. And the Minister is flying a kite here, because there is no way. The schools are also a workplace, as well as being important for children and parents for them to return to. But there is no way you can do it with the sort of pupil-teacher ratio we have. And only this week, the Minister flatly refused to relook at the ratio in light of the COVID crisis in questioning in the Dáil. So this is a serious issue that needs negotiation with the workers in the schools, who are the teachers and the cleaners and the principals. But it also needs huge consideration. And yes, just to repeat, I am for mandatory masking on public transport and in shops, but I believe the government must resource and provide those masks to the people in order to keep the virus down.
Simon Harris, before I go to Matt